Welcome to the State of the Nation weekly update, brought to you by Pace Car Rental. If you need to rent a car, Pace Car Rental are the people. Use the code SONA to get a discount. They help this show move forward and help us to present you with some top analysis and great interviews with influential people. So, the elections have happened and the results are in. And now confusion reigns. And boy, has the situation got very, very confusing. Just a quick recap. By now, you've been blown away with the news. We understand that the ANC did much worse than most people expected, coming in below 40%. The DA held steady around the 21% level. EFF declined to just below 10%. And the big surprise, of course, was the emergence of Mkhonto Wesizwe under Jacob Zuma, which came from nowhere to get 14.5% and become the third biggest party in South Africa. Which, of course, raises the question of what does it show about each of the parties? Well, let's take them in order. What these elections proved is that the ANC has no future. As they showed in their campaign, all they can do is campaign on the past. They have no idea as to what to offer a future in South Africa, and it's showing. The election strategy of hope, in other words, we hope we get a majority, was their sum total of their election plan. And needless to say, now that they are no longer a majority party, they have no plan because their entire strategy was using hope as the strategy. The Democratic Alliance has proved that race is alive and well and living in South African politics. People will vote along racial and tribal and ethnic lines. The DA's policy of trying to recapture the votes that they lost to the Freedom Front Plus in 2019 worked, and they got the majority of those votes back, but failed to make inroads into the big black market in South Africa and remain, even though they're the official opposition, they remain closer to 20% and hard to see how they're going to move away from that. Mkhonto Wesizwe, coming from nowhere to getting 14.5%. Well, it shows two things. It shows you just how popular Jacob Zuma remains. The man is charismatic, and in a sea full of uncharismatic opponents, he's the only guy you really want to listen to because at least it sounds like he's having a bit of fun. Of course, one has to say that his attraction to the Zulu-speaking voter is absolute. Nobody connected with his constituency better than Jacob Zuma did with the Zulu constituency in KZN. It's remarkable, and it just goes to show what a big role personality can make. Pretty much like we're seeing in America with Donald Trump. Personality can sometimes trump policy, and Jacob Zuma is proving that in South Africa. And then we have the EFF that also seemed to have a strategy, but only one, and that was that they were going to grow and become the official opposition. Many within the EFF circles were talking about getting in excess of 20%, becoming the official opposition. Well, they made a backward step. They seem to be mired around the 10% level, and they must start asking themselves some questions as to why it is that in South Africa, with some of the issues that we have, that the EFF failed to grow. So that was really just an overview of the parties. Some of the other participants, IFP, I think they were hoping for a better outcome. Obviously, their hopes were dented quite largely by Mkhonto Wesizwe's emergence, but they failed to grow much. Freedom Front Plus, as we said, they struggled as many of their voters that did lend them their votes in 2019 went back to the Democratic Alliance. The real disappointment was some of these new parties, many of whom we featured on State of the Nation, Action SA, and I think herein lies part of the problem. Action SA, Rise Mzansi, Build One South Africa. It's hard to not put them all into one sentence, and I think it was very difficult that these three entities came along at the same time with a similar offering, and everybody seems to put them in there, and people seem to have a hard time discerning one from another. So you tend to put them in as if they're one group, a bit like you would have if you've got triplets. They're called the triplets, and everybody forgets their names. And then, of course, one must definitely talk about the Patriotic Alliance that came out almost from nowhere, from a bit player. I think we must remember that they have stood in 2 previous elections, but this time they got really, really muscular. Gayton McKenzie covered a lot of ground. He gave a lot of interviews, including a couple on the State of the Nation. And he definitely had appeal. And it does show that there is a constituency floating out there, the coloured vote, that wasn't being looked after by anybody. Right? That vote was there for the taking in the past by the ANC. It was there for the taking back in the early days by the National Party, and for a while by the Democratic Alliance. But nobody seemed to be talking directly to that particular constituency until Gayton McKenzie came along. He did really well, and now he's off to Parliament, and he's going to have a significant say in the future of South Africa. So let's have a look at what the options are. We all know that everybody is dead scared of coalitions, and for good reason. They haven't worked particularly well in some of the major metros, but they are a fact of life. There is nothing we can do about it. No particular party got a majority, so here we are talking coalitions. They fall into roughly three categories. We all know that immediately when one looked at the numbers, there seemed to be a tie-up that everybody thought was quite palatable, especially for business, and that was between the ANC, the DA, and possibly the IFP. You kind of divvy up the country. You give the DA Gauteng, you give the IFP KZN, you give the ANC government. You sort of do that, and everybody goes along, and South Africa turns into another post-94 scenario with the whole world liking that outcome. It all seemed good, but the paint seemed to peel on that one pretty quickly, because it doesn't look like a very likely scenario, and we'll get into that pretty soon. The next one that is possible was the one that in many ways Jacob Zuma said was his intention all along, was to make the ANC be aware that they've taken the wrong road, and he was going to show them what the right road was and correct them, which was really the dog whistle to say, we'll go out there, you'll lose your majority, and then we'll reform as part of the ANC and get the ANC going in the right direction again. That one is still on the table, and we'll discuss that further. The other alternative was the one that has been in place, that is currently in places like Johannesburg or Kuruleni, and that is a tie-up between the ANC, the EFF, and the Patriotic Alliance. They are currently running Johannesburg like that and running a Kuruleni like that, a few other places. So that is already a partnership that has been on a smaller stage, and the idea is you roll it out to a bigger stage. It did make some sense, especially to Julius Malema and Gayton McKenzie, who are desperate to get their hands onto some bit of national power, I presume bigger budgets. But the problem with that particular scenario is that they didn't get hectic numbers. If you put those three groups together, you end up with about, I think, just shy of 53%. It's not a great majority, and you open yourself up to being destabilized. Of course, there was a lot of talk about just how much the ANC has enjoyed those coalitions, where the EFF is an unstable partner, and that kind of instability voters don't like. And I think that has also been a contributing factor to the decline of both parties, the ANC and the EFF, because you can't help looking at what they've done in places like Johannesburg and Ekurhuleni, and even down in eThekwini, down in KZN, without saying, are these people serious about governance, or do they just want to put their hands on the levers of power and enjoy the good stuff that goes with it. So there is some of the adults in the room saying perhaps that's not a great idea to replicate that on the national stage. Of course, it wasn't long before Cyril Ramaphosa went straight back to the Cyril Ramaphosa playbook. And that is, we all get into the room, we all hold hands, we sing Kumbaya, but we're in charge. And that is the government of national unity. What I want to do is just spend a minute to explain the difference between a coalition and a government of national unity. A coalition, as the name suggests, a couple of parties get together, they hammer out a deal. The deal is literally a contract that says, you get this, I get that, here we go, and in return, somebody becomes the president, and therefore my 40% and your 20% gives us 60%. That's how we rule with that majority, and the parties then work very, very closely together, and that would be the way that a coalition would run things. And it has worked in various places, but coalitions always carry their own issues with it. The biggest issue being that the large party often dominates the discussion, as they should. They feel that they're the large party. In this case, the ANC would be bringing 40% to the party, and the smaller partner will be bringing less, and pretty soon the smaller partner says, I want more. The bigger party tells the smaller party to go to hell, or vice versa, and coalitions can be quite unstable. But we understand what it is. It's a merger. It's a short-term merger between parties. Often the biggest problem with that is to regain your identity once that has run its course. But what is a government of national unity? A government of national unity is a different beast altogether. It's not a coalition. It's what you do in times of crisis. The most famous governments of national unity often happen in wartime. We think back to Second World War. In the United Kingdom, all political activity was suspended. The Conservatives happened to be in power. They had Winston Churchill, who looked like an obvious wartime leader. And the Labour Party, as they were, in fact, I think they were at that point called the Liberal Democrats. The Labour Party was born, they weren't the party they are now. But the point is that the opposition parties said, we are all one government, use us to the best of our ability. And they had a wartime cabinet that was made up of a whole lot of people from a whole lot of different parties. It was almost like you suspend your party badge, you all go into Team South Africa. That has worked in wartime. In fact, in Ukraine at the moment, oddly enough, there's a government of national unity while they sit there and fight a war. A lot of people point to the fact that after 1994, to a small degree, we had a government of national unity in South Africa. I would contest this. It was a government of national unity on paper. But in reality, the ANC had galloped to victory. They had over 60% support. Nelson Mandela was the undisputed leader of the country. The cabinet, although it included ministers from some of the other parties, they were generally in the smaller, less important ministries, and they were almost from day one being overridden by this big partner. It didn't feel so much like a government of national unity where everybody had mutual respect. The ANC was getting ready to govern, and those smaller parties felt it increasingly uncomfortable to be in the government. And within 2 years or so, just about everybody had left except for Mangosuthu Buthelezi, who was hanging on grimly to his cabinet position. But all back in the day, all those National Party ministers and some of the people that were brought in from outside of politics left, and it became the ANC show with Buthelezi refusing to move. So that is what a government of national unity is, and that is what Cyril Ramaphosa and the ANC are trying to put forward. And it's not working. So why isn't this working? And what is at play in South African politics right now? Well, it's quite plain to see from my perspective what's going on here. And that is that Umkhonto we Sizwe is what we'd call a post-truth populist party. This is something that you see, for example, with Vladimir Putin, to a lesser degree with Donald Trump. They do a similar thing, but they just do it differently. And that is, you deny the truth. You just invent your own truth, right? You are popular because you are telegenic, but truth doesn't really matter. And you become as difficult as possible to work with. We see that Umkhonto we Sizwe is going to challenge the results of the election. They believe they won the election outright and that the IEC has denied them millions and millions of votes. They don't really have evidence. They say, oh, we know something that you don't, but they won't declare it. It's just going to be a very difficult party to work with. They've also spotted something else, which wasn't that difficult to see. And that is that any government that includes the Democratic Alliance between MK and EFF can just say that the ANC have sold out to the whites, to white monopoly capital, and this will make the ANC dreadfully unpopular from that moment onward. So the only way to get around it is to try and force them into a government of national unity. But both MK and EFF have worked out quite simply that you give the ANC almost no option but to work with the DA, and then you run around telling the whole world that they are being paid off by Stellenbosch, that the Ruperts are running the country, or the Oppenheimers, or whatever else it is that you like to say. But that is what is at play at the moment. MK and EFF are doing their best to try and force the ANC into a position where they have nobody left to do a deal with but the DA. And that's why I think that there's a huge problem looming for South Africa, where the DA sits and says, look, we'll do a deal, but the ANC understand that if they do a deal with the DA, they'll be signing their own death warrant. So I see this as just creating more and more mayhem. And I see it becoming less and less likely that there's a workable coalition by the time the final bell rings for this, which is in about a week's time, i.e. 2 weeks after the results have been announced, which will be sometime towards the end of June. And we need to move really fast. So what happens if a coalition or a government of national unity isn't formed? Well, quite simply, the people that have been voted in go to Parliament in the numbers that they go to Parliament. And in other words, 40% of the seats will be taken up by the ANC and 21% of the seats by the DA. We all know the numbers. And they will sit there. And in all likelihood, Umkhonto we Sizwe won't be there. And why won't they be there? Because that helps Jacob Zuma with his victim narrative. They're picking on us. They wouldn't listen to us, so we couldn't go to Parliament. Much like he's spoken about his prison sentence. He never says he was in contempt of court. He always says, Ramaphosa put me in jail. He broke the law quite openly, in fact, in front of the television cameras, and he tries to make out like it was some kind of political hit job. He's going to do the same thing with these elections. He's going to say, even though I can't back up these allegations that the vote was rigged, I won't go to Parliament until this issue is resolved. And obviously it can't be resolved because what he alleges isn't true. So we're going to go to Parliament. It's going to have 342 members there instead of 400. They're going to get sworn in as MPs. And the process is going to go on with a simple majority choosing the Speaker, choosing the President. It will then be almost like an ANC majority because 15% won't be there. So in other words, the ANC with a few of the small parties will get past the post. And you will have the ANC setting up government as if they were the majority. And what will happen is for the next couple of years, we'll have Jacob Zuma saying, this is illegitimate because we weren't there. We were denied our political rights. The IEC made us do it. Raymond Zondo, white monopoly capital. It's going to be a mess. And I do not see a way out of it right now. So what do you have to look forward to, dear South African? We were all hoping for a common sense solution that would help us to get back to work. I can't see that happening. I can only see more of the mayhem that we've had over the last 2 years continuing, with the business environment being continually murky, the economy, with the rand continuing to trend weaker. We do have some good news. Some good news is that it's very hard for people to sell South Africa more than they've sold it already. Everybody is uninvested in South Africa already. A good question is, what happens to the state-owned entities? Well, under this scenario, the state-owned entities for the first time will carry on without the kind of political interference that they've had. Yes, we'll be stuck with the deployed cadres, but we'll still have the media. We'll still have the spotlight. And much like we've seen with Eskom recently, they'll continue to do their job. So, buckle up. It's going to be bumpy. I don't see a coalition being formed. I don't see a government of national unity being formed. I don't see anybody climbing in to give an absolute majority in Parliament. I think we're going to go to Parliament. There's going to be what is called a minority government that will be formed. We will still have President Ramaphosa. He will be even less inclined to be a leader than what he has been in the past. And everybody is just going to go there, and Jacob Zuma is going to play with his puppet strings. Julius Malema is going to put on his overall again, take off his suit, and try and out crazy the original crazy. It's going to be a rough time.